Welcome once again to the Waitakere Junior Chess Club. Nice to see Jacob and Chris here again. I'm Gordon Morell. A couple of not so very important details there about who I am. But tonight what we're going to do is look at one of the great players from around the World War I period, around 1914, a man from Poland, named Akiba Rubinstein, one of the most famous players of his generation, who had a stellar career. Unfortunately for him, we have another guest joining us. Wonderful. Very good. Welcome. Just saying a few words about Akiba Rubinstein. A game we're going to look at, one of his most famous games that really all top players have seen and looked at and studied. And if you mention this game in the company of relatively strong players, they will all know the themes. And one of the reasons that I thought it would be good to do this is to remind us that, I mean, wonderful thing about chess is that at least the modern history of chess is written down to a very great extent, and we can learn a good deal from it. Go back and study the games. You can play all of the games that play through all the games that a grandmaster like Rubinstein played and learn an enormous amount if you took the time to do that. And in almost all cases, they're very well analyzed by strong players. So tonight we're going to look at one of his games played in 1907 against a very talented opponent from Poland, who was, I think, only 18 years old at this time, which was quite young for players of this era to be very strong players. But in any case, I noted a few details about Rubinstein. He's famous for his playing strength. He beat many world champions. He never became world champion. History and life got in his way. The World War I came, and he, like so many other players of his generation, had a very difficult time. He lived in Russia's Poland. That was a war zone. He ended up having to move around Europe in a very difficult period, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a historian, so I kind of enjoy all of these details, but it doesn't help you become a chess player to know them, so apologize for that. In any case, when you look up Rubinstein, if you Google Akiba Rubinstein, you will find him connected to many, many things that are very important to us in the chess world today. The Rubinstein variation of the French defense, Nimzo-Indian defense. On the white side, he came up with a nice system also against the Tarrasch defense. He played both sides of the Ruy-Lopez, which we saw in the game between Derek and Jacob. And he was a very big defender of the black side and made many, many contributions. And he's in some ways best known, I think, for his incredible endgame technique. He really was one of the players who taught the world how to play rook and pawn endings, which is among the most common kinds of endgames. So you can list his credits on and on and on. I noted that even late in his career, he was the leading player in Poland in 1930. Poland won the Chess Olympiad in 1930 due to no small measure because Rubinstein won 13 games and drew 4 games and didn't lose any games. So when you have such a strong grandmaster anchoring your team, you're going to do very, very well. So we're going to look at one of his games. I think a really, really sparkling game that's well worth considering. You should hopefully enjoy it. Try to draw our attention to some of what for me, I mean, I was playing through this game today a few times, and I mean, it's familiar to me, but I still think I noticed things that I hadn't noticed before. Now, I'll just stop here for a moment. This is called the symmetrical Tarrasch defense. We don't need to worry about names so much, but you can see that both players have played exactly the same moves. all right? And White's advantage of the opening move is that he gets to make the next move in an identical position. So they start off in the identical position with nothing having been moved, and now they've made a few moves, and White gets to decide a good deal of what happens next. One of the things we're going to see is within about 5-6 moves, the player who is white has played in a way that actually makes it seem like the player who is black is white. That is, the player who is black has more developed moves than the player is white. And it's worth spending a little time just watching how this happens. So one way it happens in these kinds of positions, are very common with this sort of pawn structure here, is that normally one of the things that players are worried about is they want to move these bishops, they're king's bishops, but they only want to make, and they want to get it to this square if they're white, or this square if they're black, in one move, ideally. So avoiding moving your bishop until a pawn capture takes place, so pawn capture like this, or if with black side of pawn capture like that, is one of the strategies that players use. I've played this for both sides, and it's always kind of interesting to see what your opponent tries to do. One of the things that's very common in this position is you try to make moves that are somewhat useful and not too committal. So white might play a move like this, and black might play a move like this and say, thank you very much, it's your move again, and we have the same position. So you tell me what you want to do. How are you going to keep moving without deciding to move your white bishop? How are you going to get castled without moving this? Because as soon as you move this, for example, if you move it here now I'm going to take here, and you're going to have to move it twice to get to that square. That is how probably a modern grandmaster would play. And basically the white player who chose this version of facing the terrace defense has to live with this. There's no way around that problem. You had the advantage of the first move. You chose not to do so very much with it, and that would be what you do. In this case, this is early days. The man who this defense is named after, Tarash, is still a very strong grandmaster in 1907, one of the world's best players. So he's sort of inventing this system for black at this time. So they're pioneers, these sorts of people. So they don't play as a modern grandmaster necessarily would, but they play a whole lot better than you and I play. White decides he's not going to wait around. He's going to capture that. And black gets to play his bishop from here to here, from f8 to c5, all in one move. That's just a tiny little advantage. Now, it's not much of an advantage had white decided to really play a different kind of game, which would be to take here, and give black an isolated pawn. That's one way to kind of justify this tempo loss. Is that pawn it's nice to have a pawn in the center, but it's a lonely pawn. It doesn't have any pawns anymore to the side. There's no pawns that are going to come to defend this pawn. So it's called an isolated pawn, and it can be attacked by pieces and not protected by pawns, unlike the other pawns on the board. That's one way to handle this position, but it's not what's going to happen in this game. Instead, white plays here, and black does the same, trying to make a little bit of room, maybe along this diagonal. Rubinstein eventually decides to go back here when he's hit, but it's a useful idea to take away this square. It's likely white's playing for this move, so you want to build some structure in place to keep the white pawns from tumbling too far forward too fast. So he brings the bishop back, and it looks like this pawn might be eaten here, but probably, I hope, Jacob, if I played this and did this and did this and did this and did this, there's a very big move. You can see the bar here giving black a huge advantage, winning advantage, because the queen, remember, loose pieces drop off. The queen is not protected. It's a very strong piece, but it can die just like any other piece if it doesn't have protection. So the obvious move is to take here, check. Now this queen is eating that queen, or maybe the queen's, whoops, the queen comes back here, but then the bishop will, and we have a one game. So the pawn only looks like it's available for capture. White's a strong player. He's not going to fall for that trick, but nonetheless, it's part of the position, and Rubinstein understood he could take advantage of that. So White puts his bishop on this diagonal. It could be a good space for the bishop, pointing this way into the center. Not necessarily a bad idea. We're going to see that it turns out to be a very sleepy piece in this game, but nonetheless, fair enough. And then he plays this move, queen d2. Now, everyone who's commented professionally on this game criticizes this queen move, and it's fair enough. Again, what White's trying to avoid doing is trying to make a useful move without moving this bishop, because he wants to get his bishop to here in one move. He's stubborn. He's trying to make useful moves, maybe preparing to, after queen here, maybe preparing to put a rook behind and then really attack this pawn, force you to take it, and then take with the bishop. It's an idea. It's just that the queen, to modernize, just doesn't look good on that square. And the reason is that there's always this fear of knight hops into hitting the queen. We're going to see that one of the challenges in these positions for both players is, where do you put your queen in these positions? Now, that's a very advanced kind of problem. We're going to see Rubinstein solves the problem very well, and White basically wastes a move here. It'd be much better if he wanted to do this to put the queen here and then look to bring the rook over to attack the pawn. It simply makes, it's more, what commentators would say is more harmonious. There's a bit of extra work the queen has to do on d2 that isn't well done, basically. So anyway, he plays this way, and Rubinstein decides to tuck his queen away here. Now he's no longer looking at this, and he has basically decided that, despite the fact my internet connection is unstable, basically decided that he can sacrifice this pawn for activity. And the activity is going to come in the form of White is still sitting here with his king, his bishop. He's still waiting for black to take the pawn on c4. He still wants that to happen. It's not happened yet. So White's king is still in the center. And if White trades everything off here, let's say he takes everything here, and the queen, black is reasonably happy even just to play rook here. He's castled. He's got activity down the D line. There's some possibilities of sacrifices. Bishop takes on b4, queen takes, etc. There's a lot of activity here. Now, if you were a modern day computer engine, you probably could just about take the pawn and survive. But experienced human players who don't like to get attacked over and over and over again, straight out of the opening with their king in the middle of the board, they might do as White did, George did in this game, and say, I'm not taking that pawn, that's a sucker's bet. And finally he moves the bishop. Finally then Rubinstein captures the pawn and the bishop has to move again. And we get this sort of position. And now I should ask you to look at the position. Remember, White has the first move in the game. They copied the same moves over and over and over again. And in fact, they have almost all of their pieces on the same squares after all these moves, 14 moves. except that white has still got his king in the center. He's not castled. And black has a rook on d8 instead of h1. So this is what I wanted to say. When we get to here and here, we basically got a position now where it's as if the player playing black is got the advantage of first move in a position that he quite clearly understands. And the next move is really a tremendous, it's a very simple move, but once you make it and see its consequences, it really, this is the move that today I was looking at and saying, boy, this move does so many things more than I understood it did when I first played through this game. And the move is knight to e5. Now, if we're looking at this position right now, and we're thinking about how would we attack a position? How would we try to build up an attack on either king? One of the things that you notice is both sides, they have exactly the same formations. And one of the things you try to do when you want to attack is to dislodge good defenders or trade them off. And the key defender in this position for both sides are the F knights. These are great pieces protecting very, very tender squares. Knights around kings are usually very, very formidable defenders. And what happens in this game is Rubinstein plays knight e5 and basically takes a knight that's on c6 that's not doing much. It's in the row to the bishop. And he puts it in a place where he's going to trade it for this knight. And so once we see what happens, suddenly we see now white has far fewer defenders, one fewer defender, but really you get to start to feel like this bishop is huge. This bishop is blocked still by his own knight. This knight can't do the same thing because now these pieces are really cooperating well. This bishop is looking here. The rook is looking here. There's big potential suddenly here out of an identical, almost identical position, right? It was a very small development advantage that has been transformed into a very big advantage now. Now, I think what white was hoping in this position was what he played, of course. Remember, he's a young master level player, not a grandmaster, a young energetic player, and he plays a move that I think many people would play, f4. Now, I think I reminded Jacob in my commentary on his game when he moved his f pawn from f7 to f6, he gave Derek a big chance in the game. This is a little bit similar that way. Moving your f pawns is always a big risk when your king is, sitting here or here. It's sometimes the very best move, and I don't want to say that you should never move your f pawn, but when you move an f pawn, you really do have to have a good answer to what the heck is going to happen on these sorts of diagonals. And can your center remain intact and stable? And this is going to be, I mean, when the first time you see this game, I think, oh, white's doing really well. Now he's got both his pawns rolling up the board, chasing the black pieces away. Who's better? Well, it must be white is better. He's got bigger center. He's got an avalanche. You give him a few moves, and he'll just mow black down here. These pawns will run up the board and chase this piece away. All sorts of nasty things are going to start to happen. That's the other thing to say is usually when you move the F pawn, you're almost certainly going to move the E pawn. And in all these kinds of positions, that is all well and good if you can attack. But in this case, you're going to find that you're going to get counterattack. There's a nice check. Remember, he just developed. He kind of quietly put another rook into play over here. Now he's got things looking down these lines right? These rooks are still sleepy. They're not going to do anything in this game. Those pawns are rumbling forward. But what Rubinstein had seen is he has this check, which I think most of us would find fairly easily. The king moves into the corner. And then the next move is, again, one of those moves that really propels the game forward in a way that this is what white didn't see. Probably he thought that the black player would play a move like this, right? And you can see the bar. I've got the computer engine waiting the position here. It's still better for black by a bit, but not as much of an advantage. Probably he thought he would not face this move. Move the knight to where it can be immediately captured. Of course, the problem is that this bishop is protected by this queen. So yeah, the queen can take that knight for sure, but then this bishop dies. And it is a kind of form of a loose piece, really. I'll give you one loose piece for another loose piece, but they're not equivalent pieces. If you take my knight and I take your bishop, I have a much, much better position, really a winning position. And it's not hard to demonstrate that. If we take here and take here, now we're hitting this knight with two rooks. So if we protect in a normal way, and this rook comes here, now we have a double attack. And suddenly, basically, the game is over, right? There's no way for white to both protect his bishop well and protect this pawn. If this bishop takes this pawn, the queen has to sacrifice because the king cannot go here because this bishop is sitting here. So these pawns have rolled forward in a way that really opens the diagonals decisively for bishops if they get some help from some other kind of piece, in this case, the rook. So this is a big theme. It doesn't really matter. I mean, white could take this pawn with the bishop, and then take the knight, and then the king would capture, and then the rook would come to this square anyway. Doesn't matter. Yeah, you've won an extra pawn, but the game is over. You're losing the game. That's the key. Rubinstein played here, and white reacted with what I'm sure he hoped was a reasonable defensive try. Well, that bishop on b7 is a beast. I have to get it off the board somehow. Let's trade it, and then maybe I have a real fighting chance. This knight is still hanging, so maybe I have some good options here. The problem is when the knight moved here, it also opened up this diagonal for the black queen. Not a problem for black. He's quite happy about this. So he threatens checkmate on h2. Very, very nice. You can play h3. You can play g3. It turns out neither move works very well. And the other move you can look at, well, you have to do one of the two. So he played here. It loses spectacularly. H3 also loses spectacularly. It doesn't really matter. We'll look at the way he played and then go back and look at the other. The spectacular move here is the piece that holds everything together is the bishop, and the piece that keeps it holding together is the queen. Right? There's lots of multiple attacks here, but the real foundation of the whole structure is this knight. And what we're going to find is there's a little bit of a cascade of deflections here. So the first thing that happens is black takes the knight. Now the queen is hanging here. There's no question. And in fact, that's what was played in the game. Right? Remember, the key is this piece, and the piece that holds that piece together is this queen. So we need a move that deflects the queen away from its responsibilities. and we have a very nice move with rook to d2. These are not impossible moves to find, right? Particularly if you study lots of tactics, and so one of the things that you would find in lots of tactics books is that diagram, because they take a lot of tactics from famous games, because these players showed us how to put all this together. So you can learn this, you can study it, you can become very adept at finding these kinds of combinations. So now the issue is if we take here, right, which is what happened in the game, bishop takes, and now the king has no square. This is covered, that is covered by this bishop. So the queen has to block. And what I really love, I'm going to point out, if you look down at the bottom of the board where my cursor is, you'll see +8. and that is, if you count up all the value of the pieces, you know, queen 9, a rook 5, and knight 3, and the pawns, and compare them to what white has, right? White has captured +8 points more than black. And then you look at the board and you say, what has this bishop done the whole game, right? I mean, before there was a knight here, and then there was a pawn here. This bishop might as well have been a pawn. That's all he did, was protect the knight, and he couldn't even take time to capture the rook, as it turns out. This rook's done nothing. This rook's done nothing. So if you add up the pieces that have done nothing in the game, their value is, you know, 5, 5, and 3. 13, right? So 8, well, really, you've got 13 pieces that have done nothing, and your 9 piece, the queen, is being captured by a bishop. It's black's move in this position, so we can take it if we like. Now, there's even a better move, as it turns out, and that's rook to h3. The queen can't take the rook because this bishop is pointed at the king, right? And by adding more pressure here, basically, there is no defense to, on the next move, rook taking this pawn, basically checkmate, because this bishop is still covering here. And it's now look at this stupid bishop, right? He's really done nothing, and this rook's done nothing. So the overall evaluation of the position in terms of material really is quite meaningless. What's important when you play a game of chess is what the pieces that you do have are doing, not what the pieces that are sitting beside the board that have been taken off the board are doing, because they're not doing anything. If your opponent has an abundance of pieces but is getting checkmated by a single pawn push, you win the game. That's the game. So this is, a beautiful game, to be sure. I can go back and have show you another variation, just to when we're in this position, instead of taking the queen, just to highlight the dynamics here. I was looking, I said, well, okay, we're not going to let him play this fantastic combination. So we're going to take this nasty bishop off. The one thing I'm going to have is this bishop, because that's a weak square, weak diagonal. I want to have it. But it doesn't get a whole lot better, as it turns out. Rook takes g3. The pawn is pinned. This rook is coming to this square to basically create a checkmating scenario here. There aren't a lot of good things to recommend. If you put this in an engine, it'll tell you that one way to try to fight is to play your majestic bishop on b2 to c3. It guards the d2 square, so the rook's not going to come here, and it makes a2 available so that you can defend along this line. But sometimes you just have to play what you have, right? But this is what one likely scenario. So in this position, black would have played, had they got here, this move, check. Now the king can move, but this pawn is now going to be eaten by the black pieces, and then with the knight and rook and queen all around, you're very likely to get checkmated almost instantly. If you take the knight and the bishop takes, the queen takes, now the queen is protected by, so you've got some defense here, but now this rook comes into play, check. Again, if you move the king up, the rook will take the pawn, and then we'll take your queen with that rook. And if you play here, something that you don't automatically see maybe is that you just take, because the queen can take, but now the queen goes off the board. And now you have a queen for a bishop, right? So this is another possible defense that white might have tried, but it collapses nonetheless, because if it's not the white bishop killing you, it's the black bishop killing you. And this is a great example of how two bishops and that sort of artillery combination really make it difficult to defend when you've advanced your pawns and don't have a good answer to defend these kinds of squares. They're just potent attacking pieces. And once Rubinstein had this knight g4 move to activate all of his pieces quickly, white had no chance whatsoever. So this is, as I say, a very famous game between Rotlewi and Rubinstein from 1907. And if you ask Magnus Carlsen about this game, I'm almost certain he could play it for you straight away. I saw Carlsen interviewed a couple of years ago, and someone asked him, Magnus, how would you become, what's the fastest way to become a great player? He says, play through 10,000 Grandmaster games and try to remember as many of them as you can. Right? Not a bad idea, especially for someone like Carlsen who has a near photographic memory. So anyway, we don't expect us to memorize all these games, but playing through them and thinking about them and getting a feel for some of the structures in place really does help your chess. And playing through some of these games the grandmasters really gave us in chess is a very good way to learn about. Stop there, and if you have questions, please you can ask them now, and if I have an answer, I'll give you an answer. So Jacob, any thoughts or questions about the game? It's all right if you don't, but and Chris, you've set up a tournament for the other members of the club, right?
I set up a tournament for the seniors, Gordon. I didn't set one up for the juniors because I figured if we just got a couple like we have, then you'd corral them into playing another game.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Derek if he saw your analysis of his game last week.
Yeah, I don't see Derek on my list. I see Jacob on my list, but
okay, because I saw Derek's name came up.
Yeah,
might have been in the live in the junior club.
Oh yeah. Well, I suppose, if Jacob was really keen to play, he could probably see if he could get a game anyway, right? But
yeah, well, Jacob, you're welcome to come and play in the senior club. We start at 7:30.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll stop there, and I'll stop the recording, and